Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to another build video. Today, we've got quite a whopper 3D cube board in the works. But first, let's take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, HyperGo. HyperGo.io offers you an effortless, user-friendly link in bio platform, streamlining the process of organizing and guiding visitors to your desired destinations. And best of all, HyperGo's premium features are totally free. With HyperGo, you can personalize URLs and themes to align perfectly with your brand. Access insightful analytics to better understand your audience. Enjoy the liberty of unlimited pages, allowing you to craft as many as you need. One standout feature for me is the ability to title and nest pages within other pages. This enables me to seamlessly categorize links into logical groupings. Whether it's organizing Amazon affiliate links or segregating social media platforms, HyperGo simplifies it all. The effortless navigation from one page to another elevates HyperGo as the ultimate free offering for whatever it is you're putting out there. Say goodbye to the cumbersome, cluttered single list of links that only serve to confuse and frustrate your visitors. And say hello to HyperGo, the all-in-one directory for your online endeavors. Don't wait any longer. Visit hypergo.io today to kickstart your free link in bio page. A big thanks to HyperGo for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. First things first, we have to get all our lumber milled up and cut to size. Having done enough of these boards now, I have a love-hate relationship with the first initial stages of the process. Mostly love, though. Let me explain. I love it because it's the beginning of something brand new, something tangible, and something that'll serve a purpose for many years to come. Sometimes I'll look at antique furniture and think to myself, some person at some point in time executed step one of that build. And before that point, that entire piece of furniture was just rough lumber. But after that step, they followed through on however many steps there were to bring that piece to a living, breathing piece of furniture. Now, I personally take a good deal of pride in being one of those people, but for cutting boards. And I hate it because for every step I complete, it brings me one step closer to the sanding process. I don't have much more to add to that part. Once all of my pieces are just wider than their target thickness through the planer, I find that slightly roughing the surface through the drum sander makes for a far better gluing surface. And in the case of this particular board, it's the faces of each piece that are going to be glued first. You'll see what I mean in a sec. Also, finishing off through the drum sander allows me to finely tune each piece to its target thickness. Here's a little more detail on what I meant by gluing the face of each board first. From here, I'll sandwich the thicker, darker pieces of walnut and cherry in between the lighter pieces of maple. Later on in the process, this configuration will make up the different shades of each cube, and is how the first glue up will go. Once all the sets of boards are placed on top of my high-tech PVC glue-up station, I'll give them all a quick spritz of air just to get rid of any of the lingering dust and splinters. When it comes to quality wood selections, sometimes you're at the mercy of your local lumberyard. For the most part, I get my mitts on pretty good stuff, but in this case, the maple selection was less than perfect. So I had to be especially careful on the positioning of each piece during the glue up, so that I didn't introduce any of those cracked or chipped pieces into my working pieces. Now I know what you're thinking. Kenny, why didn't you just cut those imperfections off and bring everything to a uniform size before you glued it? And my answer would be, I don't know. I made this board a long time ago and I'm finally getting around to making the video, so cut me some slack. But I'm sure I had some reason that made perfect sense to me at the time. It just makes no sense to me right now. With the boards prepped, I can now start gluing. Because I didn't take that 7 minutes and 18 seconds it would have taken me to remove all of those imperfections from the maple, I'm now spending much more time trying to align all of my boards such that when I cut them at an angle, I don't take any of those imperfections with me. I'll go ahead and repeat this process for every set of boards I have. Oh, and quick shout out to Rockler on this glue roller thingy. The roller attaches right to the top of the bottle and evenly dispenses glue onto your workpiece as you're rolling. And when you're done, it's a piece of cake to clean, which is a huge plus. I'll go ahead and slap a link to this item at the top of my Amazon affiliate page in my HyperGo profile. You'll see it right up on top for the time being. Check it out in the description below. Alright, Quick rant about content creation. It's incredibly challenging. Not only do you need to ensure that the subject of your video meets the same high quality standards as it would if you weren't filming it, but you also have to film it. Then, after filming, there's the whole post-production process. Editing, adding voiceovers, creating intros and outros, etc. All these efforts go into producing a secondary product for you, the viewer. Now, I love that you get to enjoy this for free, and really, I wouldn't have it any other way. But if there could be some form of exchange, some type of currency for watching this video, let's let it be in the form of a like and a subscribe. It's a way for me to measure the value of my work in content creation. And it's a way for you to have yet another portal of amazing content. Trust me, we all win. And hey, if you're still watching, it must be because you kind of like what you see. And no, I'm not talking about that sturdy looking mustache I have all of a sudden. That deserves its own video. With all of my boards cut to the desired angle, I'll now zip them through the drum sander to remove any saw marks that the bandsaw left behind. This step isn't super critical in the grand scheme of things, but I find cleaned up workpieces are a little easier to work with in the coming steps. And because I'm a bit of a dodo and didn't record a visual reference of this, I'll have to try to explain it best I can. I now need to square up all of my workpieces. I'll do this by removing the angled edges of maple and turning them into 90-degree angles. When looking at the end grain, I'll make my cut on each piece right at the very tip of the walnut and cherry. Take a quick look at this high-resolution screenshot. Right there. With all my workpieces now square, it's time to send them back through the drum sander to bring them to their final thickness as well as prep the surface for glue. So, for the time being, I'll take everything over to the high-tech, totally not DIY, PVC glue station, where they'll sit until I'm ready to come back to them. Because first, we need to prep some walnut strips that will make up the border for this board. I'll start by measuring the length that I need. This measurement will be twice the length of the current length of all my other workpieces. You'll see why I did it that way shortly. To create these border strips, I'll need to transfer the thickness of my existing workpieces to the walnut. To do this, I'll grab my woodworking ruler. Actually, I always thought that was kind of a lame name for that tool. And get the exact thickness of the workpiece. And at the table saw, I'll cut the needed material out of this piece of walnut. And just a quick tip on the table saw, always wear a respirator. With my 2 border strips in hand, I can now cut them in half to make 4 strips. This is why I cut twice the length of the original pieces initially. This way, the remaining leftover material is still in one long piece, rather than 2 short pieces. It's good to plan your cuts out ahead of time to maximize your material. We all know how expensive some of this lumber can be. And from here, everything gets cleaned up once again through the drum sander. With all primary pieces cut up, squared up, and cleaned up, it's now time for glue up number 2. Now, there was a time where I would say glue ups are always the most stressful part of any cutting board build. And for the most part, that still remains true. It's the only step where time really isn't on your side. So, much like planning your cuts to maximize your material, it's also very important to plan your glue ups. Taking the time to do this helps ensure the next steps of your project don't involve a bonfire. You guys know that song, The Cat Came Back the Very Next Day? Well, it's the next day, there's just no cat. With the glue dry and the workpieces out of clamps, I'll set the boards aside to work again on the walnut border. First, I'll cut my strip down to the required thickness. And from there, using my marking gauge, I'll transfer the thickness of the primary boards over to the strips of walnut. Doing this ensures that all border pieces on all 4 sides of the board are the same thickness. Now, for functionality, this is not a critical step. But for the amount that I charge for these boards, it's the finer details that really matter in the end. With my strip of walnut milled down to the target size, I'll go ahead and cross-cut it down even further into 13 individual pieces, 4.5 inches long. Then it's back to the workbench for yet another glue up. One important thing to remember when you're doing these glue ups is to tape your clamps. The time you spend taping your clamps is much shorter than the time you'll spend cleaning dried glue off of them. Trust me, I know this from experience. As I'm sure you noticed, I nearly made that exact mistake for this glue up. And if mistakes are equal to time, which they typically are, that would have easily been at least a 20 to 30 minute mistake. So, choose your mistakes wisely. Alright, let's get this thing off my workbench and get on to some of the fun stuff. I'll typically always clean up my surfaces with the handheld belt sander before running them back through the drum sander. Some may say this is not a necessary step, but I find it to be a particularly important one. If you have dried glue nubs protruding from the bottom of your workpiece, those deviations will transfer against your sanding head. And the sanding head won't properly index to the surface of your board, all because your workpiece has big old glue nubs causing it to be out of parallel with the sanding head. Sorry, I just had to get that out of my system. Let's move on. We're now at the stage of this build where it's time to cut our boards into individual slats so that each slat can be arranged into the final end grain position. One thing I find funny and can't help but to notice is the difference in material volume from the beginning stages of this build until this stage. It's actually pretty wild. Finally, a little sneak peek of what this board is going to look like, and it got me very excited. But there's still a lot of work to be done, starting with the border. I'll take this sucker out of the clamps and bring it right back over to the drum sander. And before you all give me a hard time about not cleaning this up with my belt sander first, just know that I did, and what you saw there was some simple time-saving movie magic. Now I'll go ahead and cut these border pieces down to size on the table saw and line it all up for the final glue up. Let's talk about best practices. In this case, for me, it's always best practice to do 1 or 2 dry runs on the glue up. It all boils back down to not having time on your side should you make an error. And when you're trying to achieve complex patterns, the consequences of a simple misplaced piece can make or break your workpiece. Ask me how I know this in the comments below. Unfortunately, I'll be able to provide you with more than one answer. Just remember, if your next step is bonfire, you'll wish you heeded my advice and performed at least 1 dry run. If you're observant, you've probably noticed by now that I'm applying glue to both sides of each piece. This is a technique I picked up from Ryan over at West Coast Boards. He's a grand master at complex cutting board patterns. In fact, much of my skill sets come from watching hours of his content. Now I can't tell you one way or another that gluing both sides of the board gives you a better bond than applying glue to just one side. But I can tell you that it just feels better. I don't know. If somebody smarter than me knows the answer to that, feel free to educate me in the comments below. You probably noticed there's a good handful of important things going on here. First, the use of cawls. Using cawls is critical to align your board as the clamping forces increase. If you don't use them, you'll run the risk of your individual pieces wandering out of line as you tighten your clamps. In fact, it's almost a guarantee. Remember, time is not on your side. And second, you'll notice that I used clamping force from all angles. It's yet another step you can take to try and achieve a square board out of your clamps. With the board out of the clamps and square as I'll practice what I preach and go over the entire surface with the belt sander. But instead of taking it to the drum sander next, like I normally would, first I want to do an initial flattening with my Crafted Elements flattening jig. I'll also leave a link to this item below. Completing this step first will ensure the board achieves a very high tolerance in terms of flatness. Adding any necessary shims beneath the board to prevent any wobble, then securing it with hot glue, I can now make a series of shallow passes to completely flatten the top surface. Once the top surface is totally flat, I'll repeat the exact same steps on the bottom side, but this time, because the top is totally flat, I won't need shims when I flip it over. Just hot glue, and that's that. So, I colorfully expressed that the board is super square, and it is, but there are still tiny imperfections that need dealing with. I'll do a couple of ultra shallow passes over my jointer to make the edge totally flat. Then I'll just run it over the table saw to achieve a totally parallel and flat edge. Remember my rant on glue nubs and running workpieces through the drum sander out of parallel? Well, I'm about to run the entire board through the drum sander out of parallel. But I'm going to do it on purpose. That little lever you just saw me push in, it's called the fast lever. It actually puts the below base of the drum sander out of parallel with the sanding head, but by about 3/4 of a millimeter. This is by design. Because the workpiece is wider than the sanding head, the extra space prevents overlap ridge lines from developing along the part of the workpiece that extends beyond the length of the drum. Because the base is angled down ever so slightly, the sanding head is able to smoothly transition itself over the surface of the workpiece, allowing for a smooth finish. Another thing I want to note about this entire process is that every step has the potential to be the kiss of death. Every step has the potential to make the following step bonfire fuel. That holds especially true when applying juice grooves. Well, I've gotten a lot better at this process. All it takes is one tiny slip up, and there's pretty much no coming back from it, too. In other words, I've had a good handful of awesome cutting boards end up being fun little coasters when I was done with them. With the juice groove in place, it's now time to notch in the finger holds. I typically like to make them about 1 inch tall by 1 inch deep. I don't necessarily have a preference on how wide they should be, but I believe I made this one about 5 inches wide. On the router table, I'll attach my stop blocks to the fence at the appropriate locations to achieve my 5-inch finger holds, and then I'll make one pass per side at a time. I'll repeat that until my 1-inch depth is achieved. From here, the board is pretty much in its final shape. All I'm doing is a final round over with the palm router on the corners, and then my least favorite activity in the world, sanding. So I really don't have a descriptive narrative to share for the sanding process, except maybe that I went from 80 grit all the way to 320. But that's about all I have for you there. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and cut all the sanding footage out of this video. Just know there was a lot of it. Instead, we'll move right to this imperfection that needs a little attention. I'm totally guilty of saving these silly little scrap pieces like this because I find they work great for thin shims. And lucky me, they also work great for fixing stuff like this. I'll clean up the edge just a little bit and apply a small amount of wood glue. Then I'll slip that sucker right in there and let it set up. Once dry, I'll snag my pull saw and flush cut the excess right off the board. And I really hate to have you watch the next step, but I'm gonna have to sand it. And speaking of sanding it, there is a little sanding sequence we gotta talk about. But being honest, I want to talk more about the light than the sanding process. I use this light to help identify any imperfections on the surface of the board. Then I'll just hit them with the sander. I like to repeat this process on both sides, starting with 220 and into 320. In between each sanding grit, I hit both sides of the board with water. This pops the grain on the entire board. Then I knock it back down again with the following grit. If you skip this step, your customer will have a fully grained poppin' hunk of wood the first time they wash their board. Let's avoid that. My maker's mark. I admit, I probably spend more time than I need to when I apply my mark to my workpieces, but I just can't help myself. I think the resulting mark just looks so appealing, and I think it buttons up the overall fit and feel of the finished board. I even think the bare laser etch looks pretty darn cool, but not good enough. My laser eats through wood like it's nobody's business, but dried wood glue, different story. Here I am going through picking out the remaining glue from the seams of the board. Because I'm doing this inlay with black CA glue, I'll need to seal up all of the wood grain around the logo to prevent the black CA from bleeding through. I'll do this by applying clear, thin CA glue first, then patting out the excess and letting the remaining air dry. And once I'm satisfied that all is dry, I'll go through and apply the black CA glue to the entire logo, being extremely careful not to get any black glue on any unsealed surface. Once the logo is filled, I'll take a dollar store brush and tease the glue into any voids that may exist under the surface. And from here, a few quick sprays with accelerator to harden the entire thing up. With 220 grit, I'll make a series of light passes over the logo to bring the entire thing flush to the cutting board edge. Okay, you guys, we're almost there. Just got to get these feet on, apply a stupid amount of oil, and then condition it. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned to you guys that I have a love-hate relationship with the beginning stages of these builds. Well, the same thing applies to the final stages too. Again, allow me to explain. I love it for essentially the same reason. I'm now applying the finishing touches on something that is brand new. Something that is now, at this point, physically tangible. It's something that's going to be used for years and years to come. This is the point where I get to relate. I get to think about that one person who built that one piece of furniture so long ago. They went through all the steps needed to bring that piece of furniture to life. I like to think I just did something similar here. I just executed all the steps needed to bring this living, breathing butcher block to life. And that, my friends, is pretty stinking cool. Now, I can't just tell you why I love finishing these things and get all philosophical on you guys. No, I still need to tell you why I hate finishing these things too. You see, what's not pictured in most of these shots is my actual shop. It's a total disaster, and I'm going to spend just as much time cleaning the darn thing as I did making this board. So if you're still here, I want to thank you. You are the reason I continue to produce these videos. Thanks again for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to like and subscribe so you'll be in the loop on future releases. And if you really liked it, be sure to share it with your friends and family too. A big thanks to HyperGo for sponsoring this video. Cheers all!